In the winter of 1859, 7 women vanished from Cedar Valley, Utah Territory within a span of 3 weeks. Official territorial records list them as relocated to extended family in California. But here's what the records don't tell you. None of these women had family in California. None of them owned wagons, and none of them were seen leaving town. What they all shared was a secret that could have destroyed the Mormon leadership in southern Utah and brought federal troops marching straight into their sacred valleys. These weren't just any women. They were plural wives hidden from government census takers, married in ceremonies that left no legal trace, and according to a journal discovered in 1923, buried beneath the floorboards of a collapsed cabin. They had been selling information about weapon caches to federal agents stationed at Camp Floyd. Before we continue with the story of Sarah Peton and the deadly covenant that sealed her fate, but the story of these 7 women and the desperate measures taken to silence them begins not with their disappearance, but with the mounting tensions that made their very existence a threat to everything the Mormon settlers had built in the desert. Cedar Valley stretched like a green scar across the harsh Utah landscape, 30 miles southwest of Salt Lake City. In 1859, this settlement of roughly 300 souls served as more than just another Mormon farming community. It was a carefully positioned outpost along the southern route to California, a place where travelers could rest and territorial leaders could monitor who moved through their domain. The valley itself bore the scars of recent conflict. Just 2 years earlier, President James Buchanan had declared the territory of Utah in rebellion and dispatched 2,500 federal troops to install a new territorial governor. Though the so-called Utah War had ended without major bloodshed, tensions simmered like water on a slow boil. Federal troops remained stationed at Camp Floyd 40 miles northeast, their presence a constant reminder that Washington's patience with Mormon autonomy had limits. Elder Nathaniel Carrington controlled Cedar Valley with the iron discipline of a man who understood that survival depended on absolute unity. At 42, Carrington commanded respect through a combination of genuine piety and calculated pragmatism. He had arrived in the valley in 1851 with the third wave of Mormon pioneers, bringing with him expertise in irrigation and an uncanny ability to read the political winds. Under his leadership, Cedar Valley had transformed from alkali wasteland into productive farmland, complete with a flour mill, blacksmith shop, and the largest granary south of Salt Lake City. But Carrington harbored secrets that went far beyond the community's official boundaries. Like many Mormon leaders of the era, he practiced plural marriage, not the open polygamy that outsiders imagined, but a careful system of spiritual wives whose legal status remained deliberately ambiguous. Sarah Peton had become his 4th wife in a ceremony performed by traveling Elder Thomas Hagen in the spring of 1857, witnessed only by Carrington's first wife Margaret and recorded in no official document. Sarah, 23 years old with a hair and intelligent green eyes, had joined the Mormon faith as a 17-year-old convert in Ohio. She possessed something rare among the pioneer women of Cedar Valley: literacy beyond basic scripture reading. Her father had been a newspaper editor in Cincinnati before his conversion and westward migration, and he had insisted his daughter receive the same education he might have given a son. This education, combined with her natural curiosity and her position as Carrington's plural wife, gave her access to information that most women in the territory never glimpsed. The other women who would disappear that winter shared similar circumstances. Rebecca Dalton, 26, served as the 3rd wife of Samuel Brennan, who managed the valley's grain distribution. Catherine Fletcher, 19, had been sealed to Bishop Jonas Whitman in a ceremony that technically violated territorial marriage laws. Mary Lou Kensington, 24, lived as the 2nd wife of merchant William Harper, her marriage carefully hidden from the census takers who periodically swept through Mormon settlements. Elizabeth Fairchild, 31, served as plural wife to Daniel Crawford, the valley's unofficial postmaster and keeper of territorial communications. Anna Sullivan, 22, belonged to the household of David Singleton, who coordinated supply runs to outlying settlements. Finally, there was Miriam Wallace, 28, whose husband Joshua maintained the valley small arsenal and coordinated with militia leaders throughout the region. These women lived in a shadow world, legally invisible, yet bound by the same religious and social obligations as their sister wives. They attended services separately, bore children whose births were recorded in family Bibles rather than territorial registries, and maintained households that officially didn't exist. This invisibility, designed to protect them from federal prosecution, would ultimately make them expendable. The winter of 1858 to 1859 had been particularly harsh, with snow falling as early as October and temperatures dropping well below zero for weeks at a time. The isolation that normally protected communities like Cedar Valley became oppressive, and the residents found themselves more dependent than usual on news from the outside world. It was during this long winter that federal agents had begun making discreet inquiries about weapon stockpiles in Mormon settlements. The first sign of trouble came on a bitter February morning when Samuel Brennan discovered hoof prints in the snow around his grain warehouse. The tracks belonged to at least 2 horses, neither Shaw in the distinctive pattern used by the valley's blacksmith. More troubling, the riders had approached under cover of darkness and spent considerable time examining the building's exterior walls and foundation. Elder Carrington assembled the valley's leadership council that same evening in the back room of Harper's General Store. The 7 men who gathered around the ruffian table represented the unofficial government of Cedar Valley. Carrington himself, Bishop Whitman, Samuel Brennan, William Harper, Daniel Crawford, David Singleton, and Joshua Wallace. These men had guided the community through grasshopper plagues, drought years, and the threat of federal occupation. They had developed contingency plans for various emergencies, but the scenario they faced that February night had never appeared in their most pessimistic calculations. "Federal agents have been asking questions," Crawford reported, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "3 men rode through Fairfield last week, claiming to be cattle buyers, but Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house overheard them discussing weapon caches and supply routes. They specifically mentioned Cedar Valley." The room fell silent except for the whistle of wind through gaps in the store's log walls. Each man understood the implications. Since the Utah War, territorial authorities had required all settlements to maintain defensive positions and emergency supplies. Cedar Valley's arsenal, hidden in a natural cave system 2 miles southeast of town, contained enough rifles and ammunition to equip a small army. If federal authorities discovered this cache, they could use it as justification for martial law throughout southern Utah. Bishop Whitman, his gray beard, frost-covered from the ride to the meeting, leaned forward in his chair. "How could they know about our preparations? We've been careful. Only family heads know the locations, and we've told the women nothing that could compromise security." It was Joshua Wallace who voiced what they all feared. "Someone's been talking. Someone who knows enough to point them in the right direction, but not enough to give them everything at once." The discussion continued past midnight, each man examining his own household for potential security breaches. They considered various scenarios: careless talk by teenage boys, gossip among the women, even the possibility that one of the valley's Gentile traders had been observing their activities. But as they talked, a more disturbing pattern began to emerge. Daniel Crawford had noticed his wife Elizabeth asking unusual questions about his correspondence with Salt Lake City. William Harper recalled Rebecca Dalton inquiring about the contents of supply wagons arriving from the north. Samuel Brennan admitted that his wife Rebecca had shown unexpected interest in the locations of various storage facilities around the valley. "It's the plural wives," Carrington said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "They move through our households like shadows. They hear conversations, see documents, understand more than we've given them credit for." The accusation hung in the air like incense smoke, bitter and inescapable. These men loved their plural wives, had risked legal prosecution to marry them, had built their deepest spiritual commitments around the principle of celestial marriage. But they also understood that their invisible status made these women particularly vulnerable to federal pressure and potentially valuable as informants. Over the following week, each man began monitoring his household with the suspicious attention of a counter-spy. Samuel Brennan discovered that Rebecca had been making regular trips to collect eggs from a farm 2 miles south of town, trips that took her directly past the concealed entrance to their main weapon cache. William Harper found Mary Lou's sewing basket contained a small notebook filled with what appeared to be random observations about weather and farming, until he realized that each entry corresponded to dates when supply wagons had arrived from Salt Lake City. The evidence accumulated like snow in a mountain pass, gradual at first, then overwhelmingly obvious. Elizabeth Crawford had been observed talking with strangers during market day in nearby Fairfield. Catherine Fletcher possessed information about guard schedules that she should never have known. Anna Sullivan had asked pointed questions about the valley's defensive positions. Miriam Wallace had shown unusual interest in her husband's militia correspondence, but it was Sarah Pemberton who provided the final damning proof. On March 8, 1859, Elder Carrington made a discovery that transformed suspicion into certainty. While searching through papers in his study, he found a letter in Sarah's careful handwriting, apparently never sent, describing in precise detail the layout of weapon caches throughout Cedar Valley. The letter bore no address, but its content left no doubt about its intended recipient. Federal authorities investigating Mormon defensive preparations. The letter revealed not just locations, but tactical assessments. Sarah had noted blind spots in the valley's defenses, estimated quantities of stored ammunition, and identified key supply routes that could be disrupted to isolate the community. Most damning of all, she had provided a detailed schedule of guard rotations and supply deliveries that could only have come from someone with intimate access to the leadership's planning sessions. Carrington read the letter 3 times, each reading confirming what he desperately wished to deny. Sarah possessed intelligence that went far beyond casual observation. Someone had been sharing strategic information with her, or she had been collecting it systematically over months of careful surveillance. That evening, he confronted Margaret, his first wife, and the only person who had witnessed his marriage to Sarah. Margaret's reaction confirmed his worst fears. She had noticed Sarah asking questions, requesting explanations of terms she overheard, showing interest in discussions that should have held no appeal for a woman focused on household duties. She said she wanted to understand your work better, Margaret explained, her voice heavy with the weight of betrayal. She claimed it would help her serve as a better wife if she understood the challenges facing our community. I thought it showed dedication to your calling. The pattern extended beyond Sarah's individual actions. Margaret revealed that she had observed informal conversations among the plural wives during their separate religious meetings. These women, isolated from the community's official decision-making processes, had developed their own information network. They shared observations, compared notes about their husbands' activities, and speculated about community affairs with the analytical attention that their intelligence and education demanded. They feel excluded. Margaret said they know they're not counted in census records, that their children's births aren't officially registered, that they have no legal standing if something happens to their husbands. I think they began gathering information as a way to protect themselves, to understand the forces that could destroy their families. But protection had apparently evolved into something more calculated. Over the following days, as the Leadership Council continued their investigation, they discovered evidence that the plural wives had been systematically documenting sensitive information. Rebecca Dalton possessed sketches of the grain warehouse layout that included details about hidden storage compartments. Catherine Fletcher had compiled a list of community members with military experience. Mary Lou Kensington maintained detailed records of supply deliveries that correlated precisely with federal intelligence reports. The scope of the intelligence operation stunned the Valley's leadership. These women, dismissed as invisible appendages to the community's real decision-makers, had created an intelligence network that rivaled anything the federal government might have established through conventional espionage. Joshua Wallace discovered the final piece of the puzzle. While cleaning his rifle on March 15th, hidden inside the weapon's stock wrapped in oiled cloth, he found a small roll of banknotes totaling $67. More money than most farming families saw in an entire year. The bills bore mint marks indicating they had been issued by federal banks in California, not by local territorial institutions. The money represented payment. The plural wives hadn't been gathering information out of curiosity or self-protection. They had been selling intelligence to federal agents. The realization struck the community's leadership like a physical blow. These women, bound to them by the most sacred religious commitments, had been systematically betraying secrets that could lead to military occupation and the destruction of everything the Mormon pioneers had built in Utah Territory. The discovery of federal payment transformed the Leadership Council's response from investigation to crisis management. Elder Carrington called an emergency meeting for March 18th, gathering the 7 men in the pre-dawn darkness of Samuel Brennan's root cellar, 20 foot underground and insulated by layers of earth, and stored vegetables from any possibility of eavesdropping. The situation had evolved beyond simple betrayal. If federal agents possessed detailed intelligence about Cedar Valley's defenses and supply networks, they could use this information to justify immediate military action. More critically, the agents might demand testimony from their sources, testimony that would expose not just the illegal weapons caches, but the entire structure of plural marriage that the community had worked so carefully to conceal. They know too much to simply disappear, Bishop Whitman observed, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Federal agents will expect continued contact with their sources. If the women simply vanish, it could trigger exactly the kind of investigation we're trying to prevent. David Singleton, whose wife Anna had been among those discovered with suspicious intelligence, raised another troubling possibility. What if they've already provided information beyond what we've discovered? What if federal agents know about other communities, other weapon sites? Our wives might have been part of a coordinated intelligence operation spanning the entire territory. The scope of potential exposure terrified the council members. Cedar Valley served as a communication hub for Mormon settlements throughout southwestern Utah. Information gathered there could compromise defensive preparations across thousands of square miles, potentially exposing tens of thousands of Mormon families to federal retaliation. Daniel Crawford, whose postal duties gave him insight into territorial communications, provided a chilling assessment of their timeline. Federal troops at Camp Floyd have been conducting routine patrols throughout the territory, but the pattern has changed in the last month. They're concentrating on areas that happen to coincide with our major supply routes and defensive positions. Someone has been providing them with very specific guidance. The evidence suggested a coordinated effort that went far beyond opportunistic betrayal. The plural wives had apparently been recruited systematically, perhaps identified specifically because their invisible legal status made them both knowledgeable about community secrets and vulnerable to federal pressure. William Harper, whose store served as an unofficial community center, recalled observing strangers in town who had claimed to be traveling merchants, but showed little interest in purchasing goods. They spent most of their time talking with people, asking questions about local families and community organization. I assumed they were just curious travelers, but now the pattern of federal intelligence gathering became clearer as the council members shared their observations. Agents had been operating in the valley for months, possibly since the previous summer, gradually building relationships with potential sources and identifying vulnerable individuals who might be persuaded to provide information. Sarah Peton's educational background made her particularly valuable as an intelligence source. Unlike most pioneer women, she could read complex documents, understand military terminology, and analyze strategic information with sophisticated insight. Her position as Carrington's plural wife gave her access to leadership discussions, while her invisible legal status made her desperate for some form of security and recognition. They promised them something, Carrington said, his voice heavy with the weight of realization. Protection, legal recognition, maybe even transportation out of the territory if federal authorities took control. These women have been living in constant fear that their marriages might be declared illegal, their children illegitimate. Federal agents offered them a way out, but the offer had been a trap. By accepting payment and providing intelligence, the plural wives had made themselves accomplices to federal espionage. If discovered by territorial authorities, they faced potential charges of treason. If abandoned by their federal handlers, they faced the certainty of community exile and the loss of everything they had tried to protect. The council spent hours analyzing their options, each alternative carrying devastating consequences. They could attempt to expose the federal intelligence operation, but doing so would require revealing details about their own defensive preparations and admitting the existence of plural marriages they had sworn to keep secret. They could try to negotiate with federal authorities, but any negotiation would acknowledge guilt and invite further investigation. Samuel Brennan proposed a solution that would haunt Cedar Valley for decades to come. What if they simply weren't here when federal agents return? What if they had decided to relocate somewhere safer, somewhere beyond the reach of territorial politics? The suggestion carried implications that none of the men wanted to acknowledge explicitly. But as they sat in the suffocating darkness of the root cellar, surrounded by the community's winter food supplies, they began planning what they would later call the Purification Covenant, an agreement that would preserve their community's security by ensuring that their sources of intelligence leak could never testify against them. Sarah Peton first sensed danger on the morning of March 22nd when she noticed Elder Carrington observing her with the calculating attention of a man studying livestock at market. His usual warmth had been replaced by something that made her skin crawl, a combination of disappointment and cold assessment that suggested their relationship had fundamentally changed. The shift in behavior extended beyond her husband. Throughout Cedar Valley, the atmosphere had grown thick with unspoken tensions. Conversations stopped when certain women entered rooms. Husbands began asking pointed questions about daily activities and requesting detailed explanations for routine errands. Most disturbing of all, the plural wives found themselves increasingly isolated from their sister wives and excluded from family discussions that had once included them. Margaret Carrington, who had always treated Sarah with cautious kindness, now watched her with undisguised suspicion. During their shared household duties, Margaret made comments that carried implications Sarah preferred not to examine too closely. It's strange how much some people notice, Margaret observed while they prepared bread for the week's baking. Details that wouldn't interest most women seem to fascinate those who have different loyalties. Sarah's attempts to maintain normal routines became increasingly difficult as community members began treating her and the other plural wives like potential threats. When she visited Harper's General Store, William Harper watched her movements with obvious suspicion, noting which items she examined and timing how long she remained in the building. During worship services, she found herself seated with the other suspect women in a section that seemed designed for observation rather than participation. The isolation created its own form of terror. Sarah began to understand that she and 6 other women had been classified as enemies of the community they had served faithfully for years. Their invisible legal status, once a protection from federal prosecution, now made them vulnerable to actions that could be taken without official documentation or accountability. On March 25th, Sarah discovered clear evidence that her situation had become desperate. While cleaning her husband's study, she found a partially completed letter in Carrington's handwriting addressed to territorial authorities in Salt Lake City. The letter described security concerns regarding certain community members and requested guidance about relocation procedures for individuals whose loyalty had become questionable. The clinical language couldn't disguise the letter's implications. The community leadership was seeking official authorization to remove the plural wives from Cedar Valley permanently. The reference to relocation procedures suggested they were planning something that required careful coordination with territorial authorities, something that would leave no traces for federal investigators to follow. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would determine whether she lived or died in the coming weeks. Instead of confronting her husband directly, she began her own intelligence operation, using the same skills that had made her valuable to federal agents to gather information about the community's plans for her disposal. Her investigation revealed the existence of the Leadership Council's emergency meetings and the development of what they called the Purification Covenant. By carefully observing patterns of movement and listening to fragments of overheard conversations, Sarah pieced together the general outline of a plan that would remove all 7 plural wives from the valley while maintaining plausible explanations for their absence. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. The women would be told they were being relocated to safer communities away from federal attention. They would travel in small groups under the protection of trusted community members, taking routes through remote mountain passes where accidents could occur naturally. If anyone investigated their disappearances, the community would provide documentation showing that the women had chosen to relocate voluntarily. Sarah's discovery of the plan coincided with increasingly obvious surveillance. Joshua Wallace had begun following his wife Miriam during her daily activities, noting her destinations and timing her absences from home. David Singleton conducted unannounced inspections of Anna's personal belongings, searching for additional evidence of her intelligence activities. Samuel Brennan questioned Rebecca extensively about her past conversations with strangers, demanding details about meetings that had occurred months earlier. The pressure was designed to prevent the women from communicating with each other or coordinating any response to their situation, but it also created opportunities for someone observant enough to recognize the pattern and bold enough to act on that recognition. On March 28th, Sarah Peton made contact with Catherine Fletcher during a chance encounter at the communal well. Using carefully coded language, she confirmed that Catherine had also noticed the changed behavior and sensed impending danger. More importantly, Catherine revealed that she had overheard Bishop Whitman discussing travel arrangements with Daniel Crawford, arrangements that involved escort duties and mountain passages. The two women agreed to warn the others, without alerting the community leadership to their collaboration. Over the following 3 days, using a network of subtle signals and brief encounters, they managed to contact Rebecca Dalton, Mary Lou Kensington, Elizabeth Crawford, Anna Sullivan, and Miriam Wallace. Each woman confirmed the same pattern: increased surveillance, suspicious questions, and discussions among their husbands about security measures and community protection. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Cedar Valley intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. By April 1st, the 7 women had developed a desperate understanding of their situation. They were targets of a coordinated elimination plan that would remove them permanently, while providing cover stories that would satisfy both territorial authorities and federal investigators. Their only hope for survival lay in escape. But escape from Cedar Valley in early spring meant crossing mountain passes that remained snow-blocked and traveling through territories controlled by the very community that wanted them eliminated. Sarah Peton volunteered to serve as the group's coordinator, using her educational advantages and her position as Elder Carrington's wife to gather intelligence about the community's timeline and procedures. What she discovered in her husband's private papers on April 3rd confirmed their worst fears and started a countdown that would determine whether any of them would live to see summer. The document that sealed the fate of Cedar Valley's plural wives was a letter dated April 2nd, 1859, addressed to Bishop Samuel Richards in Salt Lake City. Sarah discovered it hidden beneath other papers in her husband's desk, apparently awaiting final review before dispatch. The letter, written in Elder Carrington's precise handwriting, outlined the purification covenant in terms that made its deadly intentions unmistakably clear. See 7 individuals whose loyalty to our community has become compromised will be relocated according to established protocols. The letter read, Brother Joshua Wallace will coordinate mountain passage arrangements for the first group, departing April 8th via the southern route through Cedar Canyon. Brother David Singleton will arrange similar accommodations for the second group, departing April 12th via the eastern passage through Soldier Summit. Documentation will reflect voluntary relocation to established settlements in Nevada Territory. But it was the letter's final paragraph that revealed the true nature of the relocation. Should natural hazards prove insurmountable during mountain passage, territorial authorities will be notified that these individuals chose to continue westward despite warnings about seasonal travel conditions. Brother Crawford has prepared documentation indicating their intention to establish new homes in California beyond the reach of federal jurisdiction. Sarah understood immediately that she was reading a murder plan disguised as administrative correspondence. The natural hazards and insurmountable mountain passages were euphemisms for deliberately engineered deaths. The community leadership had decided that 7 women knew too much to live, but their elimination needed to appear accidental to avoid triggering the federal investigation they were trying to prevent. The timeline gave her 5 days to save 7 lives. That night, using signals they had developed over the previous week, Sarah summoned the other 6 women to an emergency meeting in the abandoned root cellar behind the Fletcher property. The 8-foot-deep excavation, originally intended for winter food storage, but never completed, provided perfect concealment for their desperate conference. "They're going to kill us," Sarah announced without preamble, showing them the letter she had copied by hand during her brief opportunity in Carrington's study. "Not immediately, not obviously, but they're going to arrange accidents that will eliminate us permanently while providing explanations that satisfy everyone who might ask questions." The group's reaction ranged from disbelief to terror, but Sarah's detailed knowledge of the plan, including specific dates and routes, convinced them that her intelligence was accurate. Rebecca Dalton, who had maintained her composure throughout weeks of increasing pressure, broke down completely when Sarah described the documentation that would posthumously transform them into voluntary immigrants to California. "We have to run," Catherine Fletcher said, her 19-year-old voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was suggesting tonight before they begin moving us. According to their schedule, but escape presented its own seemingly insurmountable challenges. Cedar Valley sat in a natural basin, surrounded by mountain ranges that remained snow-covered well into May. The established trails were monitored by community members loyal to the Leadership Council. Any attempt to leave would be noticed immediately and could be intercepted easily by men on horseback familiar with every possible route. Mary Lou Kensington, whose husband managed supply wagons, provided crucial intelligence about their one possible escape route. "There's a mining trail through the Aquir Mountains that connects to the Bingham Canyon area," she explained. "It's not possible for wagons, but people on foot might be able to get through if the weather holds. From Bingham Canyon, we could reach Salt Lake City and contact federal authorities directly. The route would take them across 45 miles of mountain wilderness in early spring with no guarantee that federal authorities would protect them even if they survived the journey. But it represented their only alternative to certain death at the hands of men they had once trusted with their lives." Elizabeth Crawford, the oldest of the group at 31, raised the question that none of them wanted to confront. "What about our children? What about the families we'd be abandoning?" The moral complexity of their situation created agonizing dilemmas. Sarah herself had 2 young children by Elder Carrington, and leaving them meant condemning them to grow up believing their mother had abandoned them. But staying meant certain death, and the probability that their children would be told they had died in tragic accidents. "If we're dead, we can't protect anyone," Sarah said finally. "If we're alive, maybe we can eventually find a way to reclaim our families, or at least ensure that our children know the truth about what happened to us." The decision to flee required more than emotional commitment. It demanded careful planning and precise execution. The women spent the remainder of the night developing their escape strategy, using their collective knowledge of the valley's routines and geography to identify windows of opportunity and potential resources. Anna Sullivan, whose husband managed supply runs, knew the locations of emergency supply caches maintained throughout the mountain region. Miriam Wallace, married to the community's weapons keeper, provided information about defensive positions that they would need to avoid during their escape. Catherine Fletcher, the youngest, but also the most familiar with the mountain trails from her childhood explorations, would serve as their guide through the most treacherous portions of the route. They agreed to leave separately over the next 2 days, using various pretexts to explain their temporary absences from their households. Sarah would claim illness and retire to a remote cabin supposedly to recover in isolation. Rebecca and Mary Lou would volunteer for a supply run to a neighboring settlement. Elizabeth and Anna would visit family in a distant farming community. Catherine and Miriam would join a group of young women gathering medicinal herbs in the foothills. Each woman would carry minimal supplies to avoid suspicion, meeting at predetermined locations along the mining trail before beginning their collective journey towards Salt Lake City and the federal protection that represented their only hope for survival. On April 6, 1859, as dawn light began filtering through the mountain peaks surrounding Cedar Valley, 7 women began implementing an escape plan that would either save their lives or ensure their deaths occurred on their own terms, rather than according to the community's carefully orchestrated murder schedule. Sarah Petton's escape from Cedar Valley began at 4:30 a.m. on April 7th, when she slipped from her husband's house, carrying a small bundle of food and the warmest clothing she could manage without arousing suspicion. The pre-dawn darkness provided perfect cover as she made her way to the first rendezvous point. They abandoned mining camp 3 miles northeast of town. Catherine Fletcher arrived first, followed within minutes by Elizabeth Crawford and Anna Sullivan. Their whispered greetings carried the nervous energy of women who understood they were committing themselves to a path from which there could be no return. Rebecca Dalton and Mary Lou Kensington joined them shortly before sunrise, completing the group that would either reach safety together or die together in the mountain wilderness. Miriam Wallace never arrived. The 6 women waited until full daylight, scanning the trail approaches for any sign of their missing companion. Finally, Catherine Fletcher volunteered to scout back toward the valley, returning an hour later with devastating news. Joshua Wallace's house showed signs of unusual early morning activity, with several community leaders gathered in what appeared to be an emergency conference. "I think they discovered her absence," Catherine reported, her voice heavy with the implications, "which means they know the rest of us are gone too." The discovery accelerated their timeline dangerously, but turning back was no longer an option. If the community leadership knew about their escape attempt, returning meant facing immediate implementation of the elimination plan. Their only choice was to push forward and hope they could reach Salt Lake City before organized pursuit could intercept them. The mining trail through the Aqua Mountains tested their endurance beyond anything they had anticipated. Snow remained waist-deep in many areas, forcing them to break trail through drifts that concealed loose rock and hidden crevices. The elevation gain left them gasping in the thin air, and the constant threat of avalanche required careful navigation around unstable snow fields. But the physical challenges palled beside the psychological pressure of knowing they were being hunted. By mid-morning of their first day, they could see riders moving along the valley floor behind them, systematically checking possible escape routes. The pursuers possessed superior knowledge of the terrain, better equipment, and the advantage of horses. But they also had to maintain the fiction that this was a rescue mission rather than a manhunt. Sarah's educational background proved crucial during their second day in the mountains, when they discovered that a spring snowstorm had blocked their intended route through Bingham Canyon. She was able to interpret the landscape features and identify an alternative path that would take them toward the mining camps around Park City. The route was longer and more dangerous, but it would allow them to avoid the main trails where their pursuers would expect to intercept them. Elizabeth Crawford collapsed from exhaustion on the afternoon of April 9th, unable to continue despite the group's desperate encouragement. Her 31-year-old body, weakened by years of poor nutrition and multiple pregnancies, simply could not endure the physical demands of mountain travel in early spring conditions. The other women faced an agonizing choice: abandon her to save themselves or risk everyone's capture by staying together. Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She volunteered to remain with Elizabeth, while the other 4 continued towards Salt Lake City. If they reached federal authorities successfully, they could return with help for the 2 women left behind. If they were captured or killed, Elizabeth would die with at least one companion rather than alone in the mountain wilderness. "Tell them what really happened," Sarah instructed as the group prepared to separate. "Tell them about the weapons caches, the intelligence network, and the murder plan. Make sure someone knows that we didn't abandon our families voluntarily. We were driven out by men who decided we were more dangerous alive than dead." Catherine Fletcher, Rebecca Dalton, Mary Lou Kensington, and Anna Sullivan continued their desperate journey eastward, following game trails and mining roads toward the territorial capital. Sarah Peton and Elizabeth Crawford found shelter in an abandoned prospector's cabin where they waited for rescue that would never come. The official record shows that all 7 women reached their intended destination safely. Territorial documentation filed in Salt Lake City on April 15, 1859 indicates that Sarah Peton, Elizabeth Crawford, Catherine Fletcher, Rebecca Dalton, Mary Lou Kensington, Anna Sullivan, and Miriam Wallace had relocated voluntarily to Nevada Territory in California to join extended family members. Letters supposedly written by the women themselves, thanking the Cedar Valley community for their kindness and explaining their decision to seek opportunities in more settled regions, were placed in the territorial archives. But private journals and family records tell a different story. Joshua Wallace's personal diary, discovered in 1889 during the demolition of his house, contains entries describing necessary actions taken to preserve community security and successful resolution of intelligence concerns. Daniel Crawford's correspondence with territorial authorities includes references to eliminated security risks and permanent solutions to federal infiltration. Most damning of all, Samuel Brennan's account book shows payments to mountain guides and disposal specialists that coincide exactly with the dates of the women's supposed departures. The amounts involved, nearly $200 total, represented substantial sums that could only be justified by the most serious security concerns. The 4 women who continued toward Salt Lake City were intercepted on April 11th, just 15 miles short of their destination. Their bodies were discovered the following spring by Mormon settlers, apparently victims of exposure and exhaustion during the harsh mountain winter. Federal authorities accepted the explanation that they had been overcome by unexpected weather while attempting to reach California. Sarah Peton and Elizabeth Crawford survived in the mountain cabin until late April, when their limited supplies finally ran out. Sarah's final journal entry, written on what appears to be April 28, 1859, provides a haunting testament to their final days. Elizabeth passed this morning, peaceful in the end. I have perhaps 2 days of food remaining. The snow is melting, but I lack strength to travel farther. If anyone finds these words, know that we were not traitors, but women who discovered that invisible status makes one expendable when security requires elimination of inconvenient witnesses. Miriam Wallace's fate remains the most mysterious aspect of the entire incident. Official records show her departing Cedar Valley on April 8th, but her supposed letters from Nevada contain details that suggest intimate knowledge of community events that occurred months after her departure. Some historians believe she agreed to cooperate with the elimination plan in exchange for her own survival, providing false testimony about the other women's voluntary departure while remaining hidden within the Mormon community under a new identity. The Purification Covenant succeeded in its primary objective. Federal investigators found no evidence of systematic intelligence gathering by Mormon women, and the weapon caches remained concealed until after Utah achieved statehood in 1896. The 7 women who had possessed dangerous knowledge simply vanished from the historical record. Their disappearance, explained by documentation that satisfied both territorial and federal authorities. But the cost of the success extended far beyond the lives of 7 women. The men who had ordered and carried out the eliminations found themselves trapped by the very secrecy that had protected their community. Joshua Wallace began drinking heavily within months of his wife's disappearance, eventually dying in 1863 from what his doctor diplomatically termed liver complications. Samuel Brennan developed what his contemporaries called nervous exhaustion, selling his property and moving to California in 1861. Daniel Crawford suffered recurring nightmares that made him scream in his sleep, frightening his remaining family members and earning him a reputation as a man haunted by unnamed sins. Elder Nathaniel Carrington maintained his position as community leader until 1865, when he announced his intention to serve a mission in the eastern states. He never returned to Cedar Valley, reportedly dying of pneumonia in a Philadelphia boarding house in 1867. His first wife, Margaret, later told family members that he had confessed on his deathbed to necessary evils committed to protect their community, but she never revealed specific details about his confession. The community of Cedar Valley itself began declining within a decade of the Purification Covenant. Young families moved away, citing concerns about the valley's unhealthy atmosphere and rumors of tragedy that lingered despite official denials. The irrigation system fell into disrepair as community cooperation deteriorated. By 1875, fewer than 50 residents remained in what had once been a thriving settlement of 300 souls. Modern historians studying the Utah Territory period have noted the unusual number of women who disappeared from Mormon settlements during the late 1850s, particularly plural wives, whose legal status remained ambiguous. Official records consistently show these women relocating voluntarily to other territories, but genealogical research has failed to locate evidence of their continued existence in the communities where they supposedly settled. The 1923 discovery of Sarah Peton's journal, buried beneath the floorboards of the collapsed mountain cabin, provided the first concrete evidence that the official narrative might be incomplete. But even this discovery raised more questions than it answered. The journal's final entries describe events and individuals that don't appear in any other historical records, suggesting that the intelligence network operated by the plural wives extended far beyond what the Cedar Valley leadership had suspected. More disturbing still, Sarah's journal references correspondence with federal contacts who had promised not just payment for information, but protection for the women and their children if territorial authorities discovered their activities. The failure of this protection to materialize suggests that the federal intelligence operation may have been more complex than a simple effort to gather information about Mormon weapon caches. Some historians now theorize that the plural wives were caught between competing intelligence operations, providing information to federal agents who had no intention of protecting their sources once that information was obtained. According to this theory, the women were expendable assets in a broader strategy designed to destabilize Mormon territorial authority through the systematic elimination of internal security networks. The truth about what happened in Cedar Valley during the spring of 1859 died with the participants, but its implications extended throughout the American West. Federal authorities continued investigating Mormon communities for years after the Utah War officially ended, and the pattern of disappeared witnesses suggests that the Purification Covenant may have served as a model for similar operations in other territories. In 1934, during renovation of the old Cedar Valley church building, construction workers discovered a wooden box containing personal items that had belonged to the 7 missing women. Locks of hair, wedding rings, and small photographs that families claimed to have lost decades earlier. The discovery sparked renewed interest in the case, but territorial records from the period had been carefully edited to remove references to sensitive security matters. The final piece of evidence emerged in 1961 when the demolition of Samuel Brennan's grain warehouse revealed a hidden compartment containing detailed maps of weapon caches throughout southern Utah. The maps bore notations and handwriting that matched samples from the missing women's supposed letters, suggesting that their intelligence activities had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a list of names attached to the maps. Not just the 7 women who disappeared from Cedar Valley, but dozens of other plural wives from Mormon settlements throughout the territory. Next to many of these names, someone had made small marks in red ink. Historians believe these marks indicated women who had been resolved through various means during the period between 1858 and 1862. This mystery shows us how invisible people, those deliberately excluded from official records and legal protection, become expendable when their existence threatens those in power. The plural wives of Cedar Valley possessed intelligence and independence that their community valued in theory, but found dangerous in practice. When their knowledge became a liability, their invisible status made their elimination not just possible, but simple to explain away. What do you think of this story? If you want more hidden stories the world tried to bury, make sure you subscribe to the Fear Ledger and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what comes next. See you in the next video.